Let's get the police off the streets for their safety and for your liberty. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This is Right Angle, a special three-part Right Angle this week we're calling After Dallas, and it's made possible by your monthly investment at BillWhittle.com. Well, with the slaughter of the Dallas cop killer ambush still fresh in our minds and allegations from the left that police target black people, let's back up and consider a broader issue. Why do we have police patrolling the streets at all? I stumbled upon an essay by Tom Mullen in the Huffington Post from a while back, I believe July 2015, that sparked this discussion. He raises some challenging questions. For example, firefighters don't patrol your neighborhood to prevent fire. They wait for the call. Why can't police do so as well, especially in an era when virtually every person carries a phone? Even when patrolling, police rarely come upon a serious crime in progress. Just having them out on patrol puts their lives in jeopardy. Second, our Constitution indicates that citizens bear primary responsibility for their own defense, see the Second Amendment, and that we're not subject to preemptive searches, and government agents can't investigate a crime that we've not yet committed. If you argue that a police presence deters criminals, you could also argue it enhances the sense that we live in a surveillance state with Big Brother watching, cramping our liberty. And finally, several of the recent police actions that resulted in the death of a suspect at the point of arrest or in custody started when patrolling officers noticed relatively minor infractions of law, selling cigarettes without a license, a broken taillight. Now, Stephen Green, as a little L libertarian, I'd expect you to embrace the notion of cops responding to crime, not anticipating it. But wouldn't getting cops off the streets just cede urban neighborhoods to the gangs and the thugs?
Yes and no and no and yes. This is such an evolved issue, and it goes back 100 years really when we started using the police almost as social engineers. Look, this drug war has flooded our cities with so much money, and it's trained probably 2 or 3 generations now of urban kids who would normally be entrepreneurs, who would normally be legal capitalists, that the way to riches is a life of crime. And in response to that, in response to corrupting these youth with all of this drug money, we've turned the police into they look like an occupying army. They've got the body armor on, they've got the big weapons, they've got the helmets, the riot gear, the whole thing, and so they feel like an invading and occupying army, and sometimes they act like an occupying army. If you're going to have that, boy, I'll tell you, you got to keep these guys back in their barracks. What I would like to do instead is have a reasonable number of laws to drop all this militarization, to end the no-knock SWAT raids, to end this stupid drug war, and get back to neighborhood policing, where your neighborhood cop isn't a threat. He's somebody like you who was probably hired from next door. He's a neighbor of yours. That's what he does. It's somebody you went to high school with. It's somebody you can trust. He's there to reassure you, to be a friendly presence. Instead, we have this army of occupation in our cities, and it's an un-American thing to have, isn't it? Didn't we fight a revolutionary war against that kind of thing?
Well, Bill Whittle, the famous broken windows strategy, which I am surely going to mischaracterize in my brief description of it here, that purportedly cleaned up New York City under Mayor Rudy Giuliani, seemed to go in the opposite direction, beefing up patrols, cracking down on minor crimes. Let's face it, as debased as the culture has become, doesn't government need to act with a preemptive heavy hand, a perpetual display of force?
Well, that's putting it a little strongly, Scotty. I don't think first of all, let me say I think the broken windows policy worked supremely well. I mean, there's no question it worked well. I mean, all you have to do is just look at the crime rates in Manhattan when Giuliani took over, and there's your evidence. It's solid evidence. To have police presence and to have police responding to the idea of the broken windows policy is, if we don't enforce laws against small crimes, then people will know that this is an area where we don't enforce laws against large crimes. If it turns out that windows are broken in this neighborhood, that's a sign that this is a lawless neighborhood, and off you go. So I think the policy works really well. Having a police presence on the street does not necessarily mean a violation of anybody's constitutional rights. I mean, Unmarked police cars might be a different story, but having a police presence out there is certainly not doing that. And you mentioned that we don't put firemen out on patrol. Well, there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, it usually takes a fire longer to develop than a violent crime. Violent crime is usually over in 10 or 15 seconds. A fire, you start with smoke, and usually takes minutes, several minutes, maybe almost half an hour before the fire's really going. And secondly, fires don't crouch and wait for fire trucks to go by before they start their own fires. Fires don't operate that way. We have to make, I'm not saying we need to make constitutional compromises. I think that's the way you lose your liberty. But we have to understand what is crossing the line and what is not. I think a police presence on the street is not a violation of anybody's constitutional liberty. The idea that somebody claimed that I wasn't going to go vote because there was a police car parked within 100 yards of the polling station, that is genuinely a case of that you've got something to be a little worried about. So generally speaking, I'm in favor, but I do want to say one thing, and that is very quickly, aside from these no-knock raids and stuff and increasing militarization, most police departments need a tactical squad, and more of them are going to in the future. But when you start hearing things about police officers just shooting dogs, they come to do like a routine parole thing or something, and some little poodle or little terrier just yapping. He's 2-3 feet away and he's yapping. And time again, you're hearing about these officers having to shoot this dog in self-defense and things like that. I saw a video about an officer walking through a park. He was just clearly provoking people. I mean, there's no question he was provoking them. We hold our policemen to a higher standard when we lose them. We honor them with patrols down freeways, and this is entirely appropriate because they risk their lives for us. But we also have to hold them to a higher standard of behavior as well. Because they have so much power, on-the-spot power, when we find policemen or entire departments that are abusing that power, we as a civilization need to crack down on that very quickly.
And let me just say this in anticipation of the comments under this episode and on Facebook and Twitter. Those kinds of cops, if you're outraged at what Bill and Steve just said about cops who behave that way, we're clearly not talking about you, your husband, or your wife who wears blue. Listen, years ago I read an article about a study where they removed traffic signals from intersections. As it turned out, drivers regulated their own conduct through the intersection with fewer accidents. When I was a reporter for a college newspaper, I covered a massive anti-war rally in Washington, D.C. Police were out in force, some on horseback wearing helmets, some bearing riot shields and batons. At the time, I remember thinking that if the cops weren't there, the protesters would have no one to holler at. Their presence made an ugly incident more likely. When I was a Christian camp director, we once had some defiant trespassers on the property. Now, in that rural setting with no local police, the state police were about 20 minutes away. I had to deal with it while calling the police, who arrived long after the perps were gone. The case went to court. I testified the criminals were fined. In Williamsport, Pennsylvania, years ago, I once ran down a purse snatcher, told him to give me the purse, and surprisingly he did, slinking away only to be picked up later by police based on my description. When I showed up to testify in court, he suddenly pleaded guilty. Now, these are all relatively minor incidents, but so is much of what the police officers deal with on a day-to-day basis. Yet in the course of coping with mundane infractions, they often put their lives at risk and sometimes the lives of others. It would be worth the experiment in some city to pull back the patrols and let the people regulate most of their own behavior, calling the cops only when they can't handle it themselves. It would be interesting to see the results of that study. Constant surveillance by street cameras and police patrols is not only antithetical to a free society, but it may actually endanger more lives while restricting our liberties. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the Right Angle team, I'm Scott Ott, thanking the members at BillWhittle.com for making this show possible. Have you joined yet?